January 1943. High above the frozen fields of Western Europe, a silver river of American bombers crawls through the sky. Engines drone in steady rhythm. Condensation trails stitch pale lines across the blue. Inside the formations, young crews sit sealed in aluminum shells, surrounded by cold, noise, and the quiet knowledge that today many of them will not return. Far above them, German fighters wait. For months, the pattern has been the same. The bombers come alone. The escorts turn back at the edge of range, and the Luftwaffe descends with practiced confidence. Head-on passes, cannon fire, formations breaking apart in mid-air. To experienced German pilots, the American daylight raids have become predictable, almost routine. On the ground, Allied commanders study casualty lists that grow longer each week. Over Schweinfurt, over Bremen, over Regensburg, the numbers no longer feel sustainable. And yet, somewhere in that winter sky, a quiet transformation is already taking shape. One that will soon turn laughter into fear and dominance into survival. That transformation begins with a story of how the air war reached this breaking point. By the time American bombers began crossing deep into occupied Europe in force, the war in the air already carried a long memory of failure and hard lessons. In 1942, the United States Army Air Forces arrived in Britain with a bold belief. They would break Germany's industrial heart by daylight precision bombing. Factories, oil plants, rail yards, aircraft works. The theory was simple. Tight formations of heavily armed bombers would protect themselves. Defensive firepower would replace fighter escorts. Courage would replace cover. It was an idea shaped by peacetime doctrine and the optimism of a nation just beginning to fight. The aircraft at the center of this vision was the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, brutally strong, bristling with machine guns, able to fly high and far. On paper, it looked invincible. In the skies over Europe, it proved mortal. The Luftwaffe had spent 3 years learning how to kill bombers. Over Poland, over France, over Britain, over the Eastern Front. German fighter pilots were not amateurs facing something new. They were veterans, men who had survived the Battle of Britain and lived through the brutal air war over Russia. They knew how bombers moved. They knew how formations broke under pressure. They knew where armor was thin and where nerves failed. By the summer of 1942, the first American daylight raids began in earnest. Small at first, symbolic, then growing. Targets in France, Belgium, the Low Countries. The deeper the bombers flew, the more obvious the problem became. Fighter escorts could not stay with them. The British Spitfire and Hurricane lacked the range. The American P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning were powerful machines, but even they were tied to fuel limits that forced them to turn back before the bombers reached their targets. And every time the escorts turned away, the Luftwaffe waited. German radar stations tracked the formations from the moment they crossed the coast. Controllers guided squadrons into position. Above the bombers, fighters assembled at altitude. Messerschmitt Bf-109S, Focke-Wulf FW-190S, engines idling as they formed their attack waves. Then came the dive. Head-on passes became the signature move. It was the most dangerous tactic for both sides, but it worked. The bombers' heaviest guns faced sideways and to the rear. From the front, the defensive fire thinned. German pilots learned to close fast, fire their cannons at close range, and break through before the gunners could fully react. A single burst could shatter a cockpit, rip through an engine, tear open a wing. The results were devastating. By late 1942, mission after mission returned to England with empty spaces in formation. Where once a bomber had flown, there was now only sky. In the briefing rooms of the 8th Air Force, commanders tried to remain calm. They spoke of progress, of experience, of the cost of war. But the casualty lists kept growing. In October 1943 came the raids that stripped away any remaining illusions. Schweinfurt, Regensburg, 2 massive strikes deep into Germany, one aimed at ball-bearing factories critical to the German war machine, the other at aircraft production. The bombers went in without continuous escort. The Luftwaffe met them with everything it had. Over Schweinfurt, more than 60 American bombers were lost in a single day. Hundreds of airmen killed, wounded, or captured. Entire crews vanished in fire and smoke. For the German fighter pilots, it confirmed what many already believed. The American bomber force was brave. But bravery alone did not own the sky. In mess halls across occupied Europe, Luftwaffe veterans spoke openly of their confidence. They respected the courage of the men inside the bombers, but they did not fear them. The bombers came on predictable routes, at predictable altitudes, with predictable limits. German pilots began calling the deep raids shooting galleries. Not because they were easy, but because the outcome felt inevitable. Above the clouds, arrogance grew quietly, fed by experience and success. And on the other side of the channel, inside drafty headquarters in England, another truth settled in just as heavily. The daylight bombing campaign could not survive like this, not with these losses, not with these odds, not without something new in the sky. That realization, slow, painful and unavoidable, would soon force a transformation in how the Allies fought the air war, and in how the Luftwaffe would come to fear it. And that transformation begins with the limits of courage and technology colliding in the winter of 1943. By the winter of 1943, the air war over Europe had reached a dangerous impasse. On paper, the American bomber force was growing stronger every month. New groups arrived in England. Production lines in the United States poured out B-17 and B-24s in staggering numbers. Airfields across East Anglia expanded, their runways carved into farmland that once knew only tractors and rain. But strength in numbers did not mean strength in survival. Each mission deeper into Germany carried a quiet arithmetic. For every 100 bombers sent, planners expected to lose several. For every loss, 10 men disappeared from the war. Those numbers accumulated quickly. By late 1943, the 8th Air Force had already suffered tens of thousands of casualties, killed, wounded, missing, or captured. Squadrons that had arrived in England at full strength were now flying with half their original crews. New replacements stepped into empty bunks still warm from the men who would never return. Inside the bombers, fear became routine. Crews learned to mask it with ritual. Lucky scarves, carefully folded maps, photographs taped near the instrument panel. They joked before takeoff. They grew quiet after crossing the coast. They knew the pattern. First came the flak. Black bursts climbing through the formation like slow, deadly flowers. Then the fighters, dots at first, growing larger, sharper, faster. Head-on attacks, cannon flashes, sudden explosions that left only falling debris. Every crew understood that skill improved survival, but not certainty. Meanwhile, German fighter units refined their craft. New weapons appeared in their arsenal: underwing rockets, heavy cannon, tactics designed to shatter formations in seconds. Specialized bomber-destroyer units formed, flying heavily armed versions of the FW-190. They closed in tight. They absorbed defensive fire. They fired once and watched entire bombers break apart. The imbalance became psychological as much as physical. German pilots felt the initiative belonged to them. They chose when and how to fight. They attacked from advantage, then withdrew to land, refuel and rise again. The Americans, by contrast, flew straight into the storm every time. Inside Allied command, pressure mounted. General Ira Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force, defended daylight bombing as the only way to hit Germany's war economy with precision. General Karl Spaatz believed that air power alone could break the enemy's ability to fight. Both men were right in theory, but theory bled in practice. British leaders watched closely, remembering their own experience. They had tried daylight bombing in 1939 and 1940. They had paid dearly. By 1941, the Royal Air Force had shifted almost entirely to night raids, not because they were more accurate, but because they were survivable. Now the Americans faced the same crossroads. Some officers began quietly questioning the doctrine of unescorted daylight bombing. Others argued that retreating to night would abandon the very idea that made the American air strategy different. In the middle of this debate stood the aircraft that defined the problem. The fighters simply could not go far enough. The P-47 Thunderbolt was rugged and powerful. It could dive faster than almost anything in the sky. But it drank fuel like a furnace. Even with drop tanks, it could not stay with the bombers all the way to central Germany. The P-38 Lightning had range, but it suffered from engine problems in cold, high-altitude European conditions. It performed brilliantly in the Pacific, yet struggled over Germany's winter skies. Time after time, escort squadrons peeled away just as the bombers needed them most. German pilots learned this pattern too. They waited until the last American fighter turned back. Then they attacked in waves. For them, it was no longer merely combat, it was control. Inside Luftwaffe briefing rooms, confidence hardened into something close to certainty. They spoke of attrition, of bleeding the American bomber force until it collapsed under its own losses. Some even believed that the daylight offensive would soon be abandoned altogether. And in quiet moments, they laughed at the idea that the Americans believed their bombers could fight alone. But behind closed doors on the Allied side, something else was happening. Engineers and commanders were searching desperately for an answer that did not yet exist in the sky, but soon would. They needed a fighter that could fly farther, stay longer, fight harder, and meet the Luftwaffe on its own terms, over its own territory. The need was no longer theoretical, it was urgent, it was desperate, and it would soon reshape the balance of power in the air, because while German pilots still believed the bombers were helpless without protection, the solution to that belief was already warming up on distant runways, waiting for its moment to change everything. And when it arrived, the laughter would stop. The next chapter in this story is not just about aircraft or tactics. It is about people, pride, and the moment confidence turns into fear. Long before the sky changed, the war was already being fought inside the narrow fuselages of American bombers. Most of the men were barely in their 20s, farm boys from Iowa, clerks from New York, students who had never left home before the war carried them across an ocean. They trained in wide American skies where danger was measured and failure meant instruction, not death. Then they arrived in England and learned what real combat meant. Each mission followed the same rhythm. Early wake-up, briefing room silence as maps were revealed, a quiet groan when the red yarn stretched deep into Germany. Crews memorized emergency drills, but fear was not something you could rehearse away. At altitude, oxygen masks hid expressions but not thoughts. Every man knew the odds. Complete 25 missions and you went home, if you lived long enough to finish them. Some crews named their planes, some wrote letters they never mailed, some carried good luck charms that meant nothing and everything at once. And when the fighters came, courage became mechanical. Gunners tracked targets with frozen fingers. Pilots held formation even as explosions ripped through neighboring aircraft. Men stayed at their posts while fire crept closer to their boots. They did not think in terms of strategy or doctrine. They thought in terms of the next second, the next breath, the next heartbeat. For them, the sky was not a chessboard. It was a test of endurance that never seemed to end. On the other side of that same sky flew men with a very different emotional weight. German fighter pilots were not fighting a desperate war in 1942 and 1943. They were defending territory they believed would hold. They were veterans of victories that had come quickly and decisively. Many had flown over France in 1940, over England later that year, over Russia in 1941. They had seen enemies retreat. They had seen skies they once ruled fall silent beneath them. Against that memory, the American bomber offensive seemed almost naive. Big formations, predictable routes, limited escorts. German pilots respected the bravery of the crews inside the bombers, but respect is not fear. And in war, fear is what changes behavior. Inside squadron huts and mess halls, they spoke openly of their advantage. They joked about the Americans' faith in machine guns and tight formations. They trusted in their tactics. They trusted in their skill. Most of all, they trusted that the bombers would always come without full protection. That belief would shape how they fought, and it would shape how shocked they would later become. Far from the skies, another battle was being fought inside offices and command rooms. General Ira Eaker carried the burden of every loss. He read the casualty lists, he visited hospitals, he listened to commanders argue for patience while watching squadrons shrink. General Karl Spaatz believed in air power as a war-winning force, not as support, not as supplement, as the decisive weapon. But belief does not shield men from bullets. Inside Allied headquarters, debates grew sharper with every failed mission. Some officers urged a pause in deep raids. Others warned that stopping now would surrender initiative to the enemy. And behind every discussion lay the same unspoken truth. If the bombers could not survive, the strategy could not survive either. Leadership in wartime is often remembered for bold decisions. But in this moment, leadership meant enduring doubt, facing criticism from allies, and continuing a campaign that seemed to cost more lives than it saved. Yet even in this darkness, a quiet optimism remained. Not because conditions were improving, but because change was coming. A fighter was nearing readiness that would challenge everything the Luftwaffe believed about the sky. And when that fighter arrived, it would not just protect bombers. It would rewrite the balance of confidence between hunter and hunted. And that is where the next angle of this story begins. For years, the solution to the escort problem seemed just out of reach. Designers built fighters that were fast, others that were heavily armed, some that could climb higher than anything in the sky, but none could do all three, and go the distance. Then, almost quietly, the answer emerged from an unlikely place. The North American P-51 Mustang was not born as a European war hero. It was first designed in 1940 for the British, built quickly to meet an urgent need. Early versions flew well at low altitude but lacked the high-altitude performance required for the bomber war. The transformation came when engineers fitted the Mustang with a British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Everything changed. Suddenly the aircraft could fly higher, farther, faster. With drop tanks, the Mustang could escort bombers from England to Berlin and back again. It did not need to turn away at the border. It did not abandon the bombers at the moment of greatest danger. For the first time in the war, American commanders held a fighter that could stay. It was not just a technical breakthrough, it was a strategic one. The long-standing rule of the air war, that bombers must eventually fly alone, was about to be erased. Before the Mustang, escort fighters flew defensively. They stayed close to the bombers. They circled like guardians. They reacted to attacks instead of shaping them. That doctrine would not survive 1944. When General Jimmy Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force's fighter forces, he changed everything. His order was simple and radical. The fighters were no longer just escorts. They were hunters. Instead of clinging to the bomber stream, Mustang pilots were unleashed. They ranged ahead, above, behind. They attacked German fighters as they formed up. They strafed airfields. They destroyed aircraft on the ground before they ever reached altitude. The sky was no longer a waiting place for German pilots. It became a battlefield they had to cross just to survive. This shift broke something deep inside the Luftwaffe's sense of control. For years, they had dictated the rhythm of combat. Now the rhythm turned against them. The hunted had become the hunters. Air superiority is often described in tactical terms. Numbers of aircraft, sorties flown, loss ratios calculated. But to those who lived under it, air superiority meant something far more human. For American bomber crews, it meant hope returning to the cockpit. Not safety, but the feeling that survival was no longer pure chance. For German civilians, it meant the war no longer came only at night. The sky became hostile at all hours. There was no longer a safe time to look up. And for the pilots themselves, on both sides, it marked the end of something older. The early war had carried echoes of romantic air combat, duels, aces, individual skill against individual skill. By 1944, that world was gone. The sky belonged to systems, to production lines, to fuel supply, to training pipelines. Men still fought bravely, but bravery now lived inside machines and doctrines far larger than any one pilot. And in that shift, something fundamental about warfare changed. The Mustang did not just escort bombers, it escorted the air war into a new age where dominance was not earned in moments of heroism, but in relentless control. That control would soon be tested in a way no one in Europe could ignore. Because in the winter of 1943 into 1944, the air war reached its turning point, and when that moment came, it would not arrive quietly. It would arrive in thunder, over Germany itself. The first signs of change did not arrive with fanfare. There was no single announcement, no dramatic declaration that the balance of the air war had shifted. It began quietly in the winter skies of late 1943. American bombers lifted off from frozen runways in England as they always had. The same roar of engines, the same tension in briefing rooms, the same long lines of aircraft climbing into formation. But this time, something was different. Below and beside the bombers, sleek new fighters stayed with them longer than anyone expected. The P-51 Mustang did not turn back at the familiar boundary where escorts once peeled away. It stayed. Over the Rhine, over central Germany, into airspace that had always belonged to the Luftwaffe. At first, German pilots barely noticed. They had seen new Allied fighters before. They had shot them down before. They assumed this would be no different. Then the pattern began to break. Mustang pilots did not wait near the bombers. They moved ahead of the formations. They climbed above them. They searched for German fighters as they assembled for attack. For the first time, Luftwaffe squadrons found themselves under fire before they ever reached the bombers. A flight of WWIIs climbing to altitude near Leipzig suddenly found Mustangs diving out of the sun. A group of Bf-19s forming up outside Frankfurt broke apart as tracers cut through their ranks. Confusion spread. German pilots had built their tactics around certainty. They counted on time to assemble, on altitude to position themselves, on the moment when the escorts vanished. Now that moment never came. By early January 1944, reports from Luftwaffe units carried a new tone. The Americans were everywhere. They stayed too long. They fought too aggressively. One veteran pilot described it simply, "We no longer chose when to fight. We were forced to fight." Inside American bomber formations, something else began to change. Gunners noticed fewer head-on attacks. Fewer tight formations of enemy fighters charging straight into the teeth of defensive fire. Instead, German attacks came in scattered waves, less coordinated, more cautious. Bomber crews did not call it safety, but they felt the difference. For the first time, the sky did not feel entirely owned by the enemy. Behind the scenes, Allied command watched the results with growing confidence. Loss rates began to fall, not dramatically at first, but steadily. More bombers returned with damage instead of disappearing altogether. Crews who had expected their mission count to end in fire now began to believe they might survive to the end of their tours. And for German pilots, another truth set in just as slowly. The air war was no longer something they controlled. They had built their confidence on years of experience fighting bombers without serious interference. They had believed the Americans would never solve the escort problem. Now the solution was flying beside every bomber stream. The laughter that once echoed in squadron huts faded. In its place grew something far more dangerous to morale. Uncertainty. Every scramble now carried a question mark. Would the Mustangs be waiting? Would this mission be the one that did not come back? By the end of January 1944, the change was no longer subtle. It was undeniable. The Luftwaffe had not lost the air war yet, but it had lost its sense of inevitability. And when inevitability disappears in war, fear begins to take its place. That fear would soon deepen during a single week that reshaped the skies of Europe forever. Because what had started quietly in winter would erupt violently in February, and that eruption would carry a name that German pilots would never forget. In February 1944, the air war crossed a line from which it would never return. For the Allies, it was called Operation Argument. For the men who flew it, it became known simply as Big Week. 6 days, thousands of aircraft, one relentless objective: destroy the German fighter force at its source. From February 20th to February 25th, American and British bombers struck aircraft factories, engine plants, and airfields across the Reich. Regensburg, Leipzig, Augsburg, Schweinfurt, Brunswick. every target chosen for one reason. If Germany lost its fighters, the sky would belong to the Allies. This time, the bombers did not go alone. Hundreds of P-51 Mustangs surged ahead of the formations, sweeping deep into enemy territory. They did not wait for the Luftwaffe to come to them. They hunted it in the air and on the ground. German pilots rose to meet the raids with the courage they had always shown. But courage could not compensate for the change in the battlefield. As squadrons formed to attack the bombers, Mustangs cut into them from above. As fighters tried to regroup, American escorts followed them down. As damaged aircraft limped back toward their bases, Mustangs waited near the airfields. For the first time in the war, Luftwaffe pilots felt what bomber crews had felt for years. They were being stalked. On February 20th alone, more than 100 German fighters were destroyed, some in the air, some on the ground, some before their engines ever reached full power. Day after day, the pattern repeated. German units launched with fewer aircraft. They returned with fewer pilots. Veterans who had survived years of combat watched younger flyers vanish on their first missions. Training programs had been shortened. Fuel shortages limited practice hours. New pilots climbed into cockpits without the instincts that once defined the Luftwaffe's edge. And above them all, Mustangs ruled the altitude. By the end of Big Week, the numbers told a story that words barely could. Germany had lost hundreds of fighters. But more devastating than the machines was the loss of experience. Men who could not be replaced. Leaders who could not be trained again. A culture of air combat that had taken a decade to build, broken in days. For American pilots, the change felt immediate. They no longer flew as shields for the bombers alone. They flew as masters of the sky. They strafed rail yards. They burned aircraft on runways. They chased retreating fighters until fuel gauges warned them to turn home. The Luftwaffe, once feared across Europe, now fought defensively in its own airspace. And inside German fighter units, the emotional shift was unmistakable. The laughter was gone. In its place grew something heavier, a sense that every takeoff might be the last, that every mission might end not in victory, but in survival. Some pilots spoke of the Mustangs in hushed terms, not with hatred, but with respect edged by dread. They called them long-range killers, unavoidable, relentless. By the spring of 1944, the transformation was complete. The Luftwaffe still fought, still resisted, still inflicted losses, but it no longer owned the sky. The moment arrogance turned into fear had arrived, not in a single dogfight, but in a season of relentless pressure that broke the balance of air power. And with that balance gone, everything else in the war began to shift. Because when control of the sky changes hands, the fate of armies on the ground soon follows. The next chapter is not about aircraft alone. It is about consequences, for those who lost the air, and for those who gained it. By the spring of 1944, the skies over Europe no longer told the same story they had a year before. Where German fighters once waited confidently for bomber streams to cross into unprotected airspace, they now rose with caution. Where squadrons once formed in strength, they now launched in fragments. Where veteran pilots once dominated, now young men with only weeks of training filled the cockpits. The change was not subtle. It was systemic. The Luftwaffe had lost far more than aircraft. It had lost time. It had lost fuel. It had lost experience. And in war, experience is irreplaceable. Before the arrival of long-range Allied escorts, German fighter units could rotate veterans, rest crews, and rebuild between heavy engagements. After Big Week and the month that followed, that rhythm collapsed. Factories could still produce aircraft, sometimes in impressive numbers. But there were not enough skilled pilots to fly them, and even when pilots existed, there was often not enough fuel to train them properly. A fighter built in a factory meant nothing without a man who knew how to survive in it. Training hours dropped sharply in 1944. Where a Luftwaffe pilot once received hundreds of hours before combat, many replacements now reached the front, with barely a fraction of that experience. Some went into battle after only a few weeks of instruction. The skies became a brutal classroom. For the Allies, the shift was equally dramatic, but in the opposite direction. American bomber losses declined steadily after the Mustang became a constant presence. Missions that once seemed suicidal now felt survivable. Not safe, never safe, but survivable. Crews who had entered the war expecting to die now began to talk about what they would do after it ended. Pilots imagined returning to college, gunners thought about farms and families, navigators carried maps not just of Europe, but of futures they had almost stopped believing in. Operationally, the impact was profound. With escorts controlling the skies, bombers could strike more accurately. They could fly tighter formations. They could return damaged instead of vanishing. Targets once hit sporadically now faced sustained pressure. Oil refineries, synthetic fuel plants, rail junctions, aircraft factories. The German war economy, already strained, began to fracture under the weight of uninterrupted air assault. But perhaps the most devastating effect of all was psychological. For German civilians, the war from the air became constant. There was no longer a sense that daylight belonged to safety and night to danger. The sky itself had turned hostile. For German pilots, the burden was heavier still. They flew knowing the odds were now reversed. They took off under clouds filled with enemy fighters who could follow them anywhere. The confidence that once defined the Luftwaffe, the belief that skill and experience would always prevail, was gone. And in its place stood something colder: endurance. The will to keep flying not because victory seemed possible, but because survival demanded it. The cost of air superiority was not measured only in wrecked aircraft and lost pilots. It was measured in a nation slowly realizing it no longer controlled its own sky, and that realization would soon shape events far beyond the air war itself, on beaches, in fields, and across the future of Europe. By the time Allied planners turned their full attention to the invasion of Western Europe, one truth stood above every other. No army could cross the Channel without control of the sky. The lessons of earlier wars were clear. Troops without air cover became targets. Convoys without protection became wreckage. Invasions without air superiority became disasters. By early 1944, that requirement was finally being met. Thanks to the relentless campaign against the Luftwaffe, Allied aircraft now flew over France with growing freedom. Reconnaissance planes mapped beaches and rail lines without constant interception. Fighter bombers struck bridges, marshalling yards, and road convoys almost at will. The German response grew weaker with every passing month. When Allied pilots swept the skies over Normandy in the weeks before June 6th, they met only scattered resistance. Not because German pilots lacked courage, but because they lacked numbers, fuel, and time. The once feared fighter force that had dominated Europe in 1940 was now struggling to exist in 1944. And on the morning of D-Day, the consequences of that struggle became unmistakable. As thousands of Allied ships crossed the Channel, they did so beneath a protective canopy of fighters and bombers. German aircraft appeared only in small groups, brave, isolated, and quickly driven away. For the men landing on the beaches, many of whom would never know the details of the air war above them, the absence of German air power felt like a small mercy in a day of chaos. But it was no accident. It was the result of months of air combat that had shifted the balance long before the first soldier stepped onto French sand. Behind the front lines, German commanders faced a bitter reality. They could no longer move troops by day. They could no longer concentrate armor without risking destruction from above. They could no longer rely on the skies to protect them. Every major movement now had to happen at night. Every supply run carried the risk of being spotted and destroyed. The air war had reached down from the clouds and wrapped itself around every part of the battlefield. For American pilots, especially those flying Mustangs, the knowledge was sobering. They had not simply protected bombers, they had opened the door for invasion. They had made possible the movement of armies, the landing of men, the liberation of cities. And in doing so, they had completed the transformation that began with a single technological breakthrough. From helpless bomber streams to escorted armadas, from Luftwaffe arrogance to Allied dominance, from uncertainty to control. The sky over Europe had changed owners. And when the sky changes owners, history changes with it. The final chapter of this story is not written in combat reports or victory tallies. It is written in memory, in what this shift meant then, and what it still means now.